In the heart of the 16th century, a time of great change and upheaval, a German monk named Martin Luther sparked a revolution that would shake the foundations of the Catholic Church and transform Europe. But this story isn't just about Luther. It's about the people around him, the choices they made, and the unexpected consequences of their actions. Imagine a world where a single idea, once unleashed, can lead to the death of thousands, the destruction of ancient traditions, and the birth of new ways of thinking. This is the story of Martin Luther, his followers, and the people who stood against him. Martin Luther was a complex figure, a man driven by a deep sense of moral outrage and a fiery passion for what he believed was right. In 1517, he nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Church, challenging the church's practice of selling indulgences. Indulgences were essentially tickets to heaven, which the church sold to the faithful, promising to reduce their time in purgatory. Luther saw this as a corrupt practice, one that exploited the fears and hopes of the poor. His act of defiance set off a chain reaction that would change the course of history. But Luther's revolution wasn't just about religious reform. It was also a social and political upheaval. As his ideas spread, they inspired others to question the authority of the church and the feudal system that dominated European society. One of these people was Thomas Müntzer, a former follower of Luther who took the ideas of reform much further. Müntzer called for a radical restructuring of society, where the poor and oppressed would rise up against their masters. He published pamphlets that called Luther a liar and a hypocrite, accusing him of betraying the true spirit of the Reformation by refusing to support the peasants' uprising. The Peasants' War of 1524-1525 was a bloody and brutal conflict. Nearly 100,000 peasants lost their lives as they rose against their lords, demanding better treatment and an end to feudal oppression. Luther, however, was horrified by the violence. He published a pamphlet called Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of Peasants, in which he urged the nobility to crush the rebellion with force. This shocked many of his followers, who saw him as a champion of the common people. But Luther believed that the peasants' violence was a greater evil than the injustices they were fighting against. The aftermath of the Peasants' War was devastating. Many of those who had supported the peasants, including Andreas Karlstadt, another of Luther's former followers, were hunted down and threatened with prosecution. Karlstadt, who had once been a radical reformer, turned to Luther for help and was granted refuge. He spent the rest of his life as a quiet professor in Basel, a far cry from the revolutionary he had once been. Müntzer, on the other hand, was not so fortunate. He led a group of rebels in Saxony and faced a brutal defeat. The aftermath was a scene of medieval brutality, with thousands of peasants massacred and Müntzer himself tortured and beheaded. This violence shocked even the most hardened observers, and it marked a turning point in the Reformation. The movement that had begun with Luther's call for reform had spiraled into a bloody conflict that left many questioning the true nature of the changes they sought. While the conflict raged, another figure watched from the sidelines, Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus was a humanist, a scholar who believed in the power of reason and education to bring about a better world. He was a man of the pen, not the sword, and he had initially been sympathetic to Luther's cause. Erasmus saw the corruption within the church and the need for reform, but he advocated for change through reason and persuasion, not through violence and division. In 1519, Luther wrote to Erasmus asking for his support. Erasmus replied with a letter that was both gentle and firm. He advised Luther to be more moderate, to avoid stirring up sedition, and to focus on reforming the church from within. Erasmus believed that change could be achieved through dialogue and understanding, not through confrontation and conflict. But Luther, driven by his deep-seated convictions and the urgency of his message, was not receptive to Erasmus's advice. For Luther, the time for gentle persuasion had passed. Erasmus continued to defend Luther, even as the conflict grew more intense. In a document called the Axiomata Erasmi, he argued that those who loved the gospel were the least resentful of Luther's reforms. He believed that Christians should be free to express their beliefs without fear of persecution. But as the violence escalated, Erasmus found himself increasingly isolated. The humanists who had once supported Luther were now distancing themselves from the movement. appalled by the intolerance and the destruction of knowledge and culture that were taking place in the name of reform. One of the most shocking incidents of this period was the murder of a humanist in Erfurt by a mob of Luther's followers. This act of violence was a wake-up call to many intellectuals who saw the dangers of the radical elements within the Reformation. The Zwickau dogma, which held that true Christians should spurn learning and literature, was a direct threat to the values that humanists like Erasmus held dear. Karlstadt, who had once been a learned man, burned his own books and declared that true believers should work with their hands rather than their minds. This rejection of knowledge and culture was a step too far for many, and it led to a growing divide between the humanists and the reformers. The consequences of the Reformation were far-reaching and complex. On one hand, it led to the birth of Protestantism, a new form of Christianity that emphasized personal faith and the authority of the Bible over the traditions of the Church. This had a profound impact on European society, leading to the development of new religious and political institutions. On the other hand, the Reformation also unleashed a wave of violence and intolerance that left a trail of destruction in its wake. Luther's legacy is a mixed one. He was a man of great vision and courage, who stood up to an oppressive institution and called for change. But he was also a man of his time, with all the prejudices and limitations that came with it. His intolerance towards the Jews, his support for the brutal suppression of the Peasants' War, and his rejection of the more radical elements of the Reformation have all been the subject of intense debate and criticism. The story of the Reformation is a reminder that change is never easy or straightforward. It often comes with a cost, and the path to a better world is rarely a straight one. The choices we make and the actions we take can have far-reaching consequences, and it is important to weigh the costs and benefits carefully. Luther's revolution was a turning point in history, but it also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of fanaticism and the importance of balance and moderation. In the end, the Reformation was a complex and multifaceted movement that reshaped the religious and political landscape of Europe. It was a time of great opportunity and great danger, a time when old certainties were challenged and new possibilities emerged. The story of Martin Luther and the Reformation is a story of human struggle, of the quest for truth and justice, and of the enduring power of ideas to change the world. But it is also a story of the human cost of change, and the importance of approaching reform with wisdom, compassion, and a deep respect for the values of knowledge and tolerance.